So, somewhat bizarrely, we've been given two metrics by which to decide this debate. The first thing opposition tell us they want to do is maximize utility by maximizing, freedom of opportunity, equality of opportunity. So I'm going to prove why you don't actually maximize that utility in their model, like why you might be more likely to in a liberal state. The second metric they tried is a rights claim one. So they said, even if you are overall reducing utility for certain groups like the rich, we don't care because the poor have a particular rights claim towards that. So we have utility and rights. We'll disprove this idea of rights claims as well, as to why the state shouldn't necessarily always arbitrate on the basis of rights, because they're unknowns. First of all, some direct rebuttal. So we think there was a lot of muddlement going on in opening. Like, one of the most problematic things that happened was that the opposition team seemed to ignore the words of the motion, which is our principle. The principle which we win if we can defend on the government is that governments should choose policies which maximise total utility. They then spent ages talking about why governments should maximise total utility. Great, would you like to join our side today, right? No. Then they talked about why equality of opportunity is so important. Why do they say this is so important, right? They just said it's because otherwise it's arbitrary whether you happen to be born rich, whether you happen to be born without structural problems. Their model is just as arbitrary, because under their system, if you're born and can get one of these scholarships because you're very intelligent, even if you're poor, you're going to succeed massively, right? It's just as arbitrary that you got born with a big brain, or born with the possibility of getting like a sports scholarship and being a successful sports star. That's equally arbitrary. That's harmful for their case, right? Third of all, this idea of utility calculus. We think they got confused over what they want their utility calculus to be. But to fit in with this model, if they should be happy to remove utility from the rich, it's not just removing a bit of utility. It's not just meaning Warren Buffett can't get another cruise ship. You need to justify removing much, much more utility from the rich than justify the utility given to the poor in order to prove that you care about rights more than you care about utility, right? So under that model, so if you actually are making people like Warren Buffett miserably unhappy and taking away lots of their stuff, why should they have this burden to be miserably unhappy just because they happen to be born into a beneficial part of the system in which they live, right? Why just because you're rich and may have had various benefits do you deserve to have so much more disutility than the utility might be given to the poor, right? Okay. First of all, to this idea of whether socialism, whether equality of opportunity forced upon a state is really the best way of maximising total utility at all. First of all, we think their main justification for this, rather than really a right one, is it's a nice thing to do, right? They think they're helping the poor more and the poor need to be helped. But what they didn't explain is how to justify taking this money, right? So why is it, just because I happen to have a lot of something that could give utility to other people, do I have unlimited burdens to help those people, unlimited burdens to give that away, right? We just don't necessarily see where the causality happens, especially when not all rich people are rich just because they've abused structures, but because they've been innovative. A lot of people are rich, such as, say, Warren Buffett, or people like Steve Jobs, because they've done something that's added a huge amount of value to society anyway, so they are a net contributor on a massive scale to society, which is why people feel like giving them their money voluntarily under a free basis system. So we think that's far too broad brush to just say all rich people necessarily have abused structures and therefore just have money taken away. But secondly, and this is a much more important point, actually we think that forcing equality of opportunity leads to less utility, right? Because, they gave us kind of false comparison, right? They said the poor are better off in a very equal society, in a very socialist society like Scandinavia, than they are in a country like the USA. This may or may not be true, right? But it's a false comparison, because Scandinavia, all these countries which have socialism, and where it works, have it not because it was forced upon people, but because people have a culture of helping each other, and a culture against pure capitalism, and a culture of accepting high taxes. What are some of the harms of when you force this equality of opportunity on countries like the USA, which don't have that culture, which have a resistant culture to that? First of all, you just get people doing things as much as they possibly can to avoid these sorts of measures because they don't feel it's justifiable for this money to be taken away from them. They do things like leave the country. So now, whereas previously they may have been given some tax towards the country, now they're giving nothing. What that also means is people who might invest in these countries, corporations and so on, don't want to invest because no one wants to live there and pay taxes, or they don't want to pay these corporation taxes. That's very bad. It's very bad for the overall economy, which is like your overall ability to help these people at all, right? But furthermore, you get things like lack of innovation, because people hate paying tax so much, they feel so demoralized when they pay these taxes. They think, why should I work harder at all? They don't feel the benefit of paying those taxes that you might have in a socialist country like Scandinavia, because they don't necessarily think tax is a good thing. What is a good thing? What is actually going to work in a country like the USA? It's actually having more of a culture of sort of encouraging people to give money, more trying to make people think that equality of opportunity is a good thing they need to fund. So things like encouraging them to give to charities, right? Encouraging them to think that the poor are someone who needs to be helped. Not this scrounging body who's taken all of their hard work money by force through taxes, through breaking down the structures that they perceive to be problematic in any sort of way. So it's a complete false comparison to just say that the only reason that the poor are harmed in the USA is because we're not just forcing taxes to be higher in the USA. So, okay, sure.
Yeah, so according to you, we have to prove in this debate that bad government policy makes people unhappy is good. While you can both defend big government, small government, and any good government policy, and then you win.
No, that's not true. What I'm saying is that whereas in some cases it may be helpful, it may be more appropriate to have high taxes, what you're trying to do is say that all governments should do something where they're basically prioritising rights claims over, and taking money from the rich just because on the pure basis that there are people who need it, as opposed to the idea that sometimes there are ways of dealing with a system which isn't necessarily just taking this calculus of rights, but is taking out other things like, how people feel towards those metrics. This idea of rights as well, right? Because we think that the only real justification of these rights is we think certain things are bad, right? We think it's bad that certain people are suffering even though it's undeserved and so on. There's no actual source of that calculus apart from utility itself, which is what we're trying to defend on this side of the house. We think the state should look on a pure metric of utility, because utility is the only thing that's tangible. It's the only thing that's quantifiable, right? Because we think actually states are often wrong, right? The reason why in court, for example, the state has to prove something beyond reasonable doubt is because it's doing something that is like, a physical active choice. And when you do that, you have to be certain you're right. You can't be certain you're right when you're talking about rights claims, because there's no tangible basis of rights claims whatsoever. There used to be one when people were very religious and thought there was some sort of natural law. That doesn't exist, which is why most philosophers these days would refer to just the idea of rights that actually exist tangibly as nonsense and stills. Whereas the only thing that we can do and see in our daily lives is the experience of having utility, the experience of happiness. And since it's the only known which the state can deal with, we think it's the only state known that the state has the right to, has the justification to deal with. Because otherwise, why is it necessarily just because the metric that the particular electorate that chose to elect that state thinking that rights exist? Why just because they think rights exist when they can't prove them, should other people have to face the consequences of people in their country thinking rights exist, right? So for those reasons, we're very happy to propose.